one of the first things you did as secretary, I think, tell me if I'm misstating it, is commission a kind of study of autism. Can you tell us what that is? What are you seeking to do with it?
There are a handful of studies that CDC has generated on autism. They were all epidemiological studies, and they all say what the CDC wanted them to say is they couldn't find a link. The problem is that the Institute of Medicine, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences, had said in 2001 that the link between autism and vaccine is biologically plausible. And they were highly critical of the way that CDC was making decisions about the vaccine schedule. That this group ACIP, which is an external panel, which has the responsibility of deciding which new vaccines will be added to the schedule, that they had essentially been captured by industry. The people who serve on that panel, almost all of them have financial entanglements with the industry. Instead, it commissioned the creation of these 6 epidemiological studies, and none of them does what all of them were. They use fraudulent techniques. You know, they say statistics don't lie, but statisticians do. And epidemiological studies are very easy to manipulate. None of those studies did what you would do if you wanted to find the answer, which is to compare outcomes in a fully vaccinated group to health outcomes in an unvaccinated group. And CDC did that study in 1999. They brought in a team of scientists under a Belgian researcher named Thomas Verstraeten, and they looked at the data. They looked at children who had received the hepatitis vaccine within the first 30 days of life and compared those children to children who had received the vaccine later or not at all. And they found an 135% elevated risk of autism among the vaccinated children.
Yep, you heard that right. A complete bombshell dropped by the U.S. Secretary of HHS, Robert F. Kennedy. Now, if you've been following RFK's interviews and congressional hearings, you've heard of chilling stories like this before. Now, regardless of what you think about RFK, he's been one of the largest critics of Big Pharma and its corruption. He's a big advocate for public health, and he hopes to stir things up to make right by the American people. And in what you just heard, here's what his agency looks to do now, and hopefully have some answers by September of this year.
And so what we're going to do now, and meanwhile, the external literature is showing, over 100 studies that show that indicate that there is a link. What we're going to do now is we're going to do all the kind of studies that the Institute of Medicine originally recommended. And we're going to do observational studies, retrospective studies, and epidemiological studies. We're going to do real science. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to make the databases public for the first time. We've gone into CDC. We've gotten the data from CMS, which is Medicaid and Medicare. We're getting the data from the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is the biggest repository for HMO health records. So those records would have all the records of vaccination and then the subsequent health claims. And you can do a cluster analysis and see if there's an association. More importantly, we're going to make this data available for independent scientists so everybody can look at it. And then we have already put out grant requests. Any scientist with credentials can apply for a grant and tell us how they want to go about studying these. And so we're going to get real studies done for the first time.
Now, this is a good segue into the next clip, because by real studies, he means studies published and open for discussion. So studies that aren't censored because they deviate from Big Pharma and the vaccines they come out with. So next, here is RFK explaining how Big Pharma actually pays for their studies to get published in these journals.
Richard Horton, who's the longtime editor of The Lancet, is the same thing. He says, we've become propaganda vessels for the pharmaceutical companies. And the pharmaceutical company, now you have to pay to get something published in these journals. So the pharmaceutical companies pay for something. They give they hire these mercenary scientists, we call them biostitutes, to do a study that will validate their product and, say that this statin drug works against heart attacks, and they'll mess with the data because they want it published. They're being paid by the pharmaceutical companies. Once it's published, the journal will make available preprints. The preprint is a little magazine with the logo of the Lancet on the front, and it has that one article that says this statin drug works or this SSRI works. And then they have tens of thousands of pharmaceutical reps who will take those journal articles and go to every doctor's office in the country and say, and they're usually, let me put it this way, hot-looking women, and they'll go, right, they'll go take the doctor out to lunch. They'll say, why don't you start prescribing this drug? And they'll incentivize the doctor in all kinds of ways to do that. And so the doctors also have their own incentives, perverse incentives. Published article out there now that says that 50% of revenues to most pediatricians come from from vaccines. And then there's a whole structure where Blue Cross and the other insurance companies pay bonuses to the pediatrician to make sure if, for example, 95% of if their clients are fully vaccinated, they get huge bonuses. It could be tens of thousands of dollars. And that's why your pediatrician, if you say, I want to go slow on the vaccines or I want to have a little different schedule, your pediatrician will throw you out of his practice because you're now jeopardizing that bonus structure. These are all perverse incentives that stop doctors from actually practicing medicine and caring for the client because they're looking at the bottom line.
Now, granted, not all doctors and pediatricians do this, but a majority, as RFK mentioned, stop practicing medicine and caring for their clients. So it's corruption. This actually leads into the next segment where RFK tells his story about meeting Roger Ailes, former CEO of Fox News, and him being denied from this documentary about mercury and vaccines because it was too controversial. Too controversial because, as RFK says, 75% of their ad revenue comes from Big Pharma.
And today, Roger Ailes, who both you and I knew, I had this very Roger Ailes, for your audience who doesn't know him, which I think most of them do, was the founder of Fox News. And I had this odd relationship with him because politically we were at loggerheads, but I had spent, when I was 19 years old, I spent 3 months with him in a tent in Africa. And we developed a friendship then. And as you know, he was he was a very engaging guy. He was very witty, really fun to be with. Very paranoid, but at the same time, brilliant.
Yes.
And so he was very kind to me. He was a very loyal friend to me. And he would make Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly and Neil Cavuto and all of the other hosts, your former colleagues, put me on TV to talk about the environment. Even though he didn't agree with me on it, he made them put me on. So during the 80s and 90s, I was the only environmentalist who was going on Fox News. I think it was like 2014, I brought him a documentary that we had done about mercury and vaccines, and he was completely sold on it. He had a family member who had been affected, he felt. And he said, but I can't put you on because if I did, if any of my hosts allowed you on to talk about this issue, I would have to fire them. And if I didn't, I would get a call from Rupert within 10 minutes. And he said, for the evening news division, about 75% of the advertising revenues are coming from pharma. He said that on a typical evening news show, there are 22 ads, and 17 of those are pharmaceutical ads. And so this was the principal source of revenue. And for a lot of these television networks, it's keeping them alive. As you know, they're all, kind of collapsing financially.
Yes. Collapsing due to lack of popular demand for their presence.
Right.
That's exactly it. The principal source of revenue for these media outlets come primarily from Big Pharma. So any discussions that go against their ideals is completely ruled out and not given the time of day. Pharmaceutical advertisements are extremely misleading, and here is RFK explaining why.
A lot of the pharmaceutical ads are misleading.
Yeah.
And even the music and the video, the photos that they show, the scenes that they show that's kind of speech, and it's misleading. It's sending a message. If you take this drug, you're going to be riding Chester skis and playing volleyball and water skiing and
have a great looking spouse.
Right. And kids. The side effects, meanwhile, are rolling at 80 miles an hour, and that's misleading. And so one of the things that we that we're looking at is making them be more honest about what they show. Pharmaceutical advertising is insidious for a number of reasons. That's why they don't allow it anywhere else in the world. New Zealand has a very, very limited allowance of direct-to-consumer advertising, very, very highly controlled. Compared to us, it's nothing. People who come over here from England or Europe and watch our TV are shocked by what they're seeing on it. And it's insidious because of this. Pharmaceutical advertisers are advertising the most expensive version of every drug. They're not going to advertise the generics because they're not making any money. So they're advertising the ones that are the highest profit margins for them. And normally, if you see an advertisement on TV, like for Coca-Cola, you then have a choice to go get that, and then you're paying out of your pocket for it. When somebody buys a pharmaceutical drug, it's Medicaid and Medicare that are paying for it. With us, it's the taxpayer. So they're advertising something to the consumer where the consumer has no skin in the game. And we're paying for the ads because they're tax deductible. So we're paying for them to advertise, and the advertisements are getting people to buy drugs that may be ineffective, that may be the least effective drug of the ones that are available. And they go to their physician. The physician is told by his boss, who's the corporate bean counter, you have 11 minutes with each patient, and that's it. And the physician then can spend that 11 minutes trying to talk the patient out of something that they want, and then the patient's going to go away unsatisfied. Or the physician could just say, all right, you want this prescription, I'll write it for you. And then, the patient is then going to come back because he's happy. And nobody thinks that this is good for public health. It is hurting us, and it's distorting the markets, and it's not, you can't even call it a free market because everything's paid for by the federal government.
Now, I don't know how much TV you guys watch, but I come across this all the time. Take Hulu, for example, for those who have a subscription. Almost all of their ads are pharmaceutical ads, and they're the same ones played over and over again to the point where you start memorizing the script, and you just start to laugh at how fast they roll the side effects out. It's absurd, it's somewhat intrusive too, and hopefully RFK can push reforms for these sorts of ads. Next, we have Tucker Carlson asking about vaccine injury and compensation. Let's hear what RFK has to say.
So starting in September, when we start to see the results of the analysis of these massive data sets that you're putting out there in public, and if it becomes clear that there is a connection between autism and vaccines the government promoted, in some cases effectively required, that's a tort. I mean, that means there are a lot of injured people who can now show they were injured by this product. How are they made whole? What happens to them?
Well, that's going to be complicated because in 1986, Congress passed an act, the Vaccine Act, the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, and they gave the vaccine companies immunity from liability. So no matter how reckless the company is, no matter how toxic the product, no matter how egregious your injury, you cannot sue them. And that's one of the problems. And that actually is why one of the reasons we had this explosion in the vaccination program. We just brought a guy in this week who's going to be revolutionizing the vaccine injury compensation program. When Congress passed the Vaccine Act and gave immunity from liability to vaccine companies, it recognized that the American Academy of Pediatrics were unavoidably unsafe. That some people, like for every medicine, some people are going to be injured and killed. And so it set up a program that's in the federal government called the Vaccine Courts, and they have a trust fund. The trust fund is endowed by a 75% surcharge on every vaccine. And that program is there's supposed to be a vaccine court that's supposed to be generous and fast and give the tie to the runner. In other words, if there's doubts about, whether somebody's injury came from a vaccine or not, you're going to assume they got it and compensate them. It's paid out over $5 billion now to about 12,000 people. And we're looking at ways to enlarge that program so that COVID vaccine injured people can be compensated. And we're changing the program so that, we're looking at ways to enlarge the statute of limitations. It's only 3 years. A lot of people don't discover their injuries until after that. And there's no discovery in that program. There's no rules of evidence. The program has devolved into lawyers from the justice. You're not suing the vaccine company. You're petitioning my agency, and it's represented traditionally by the Department of Justice. And the lawyers in the Department of Justice, the leaders of it, were corrupt, and they saw their job as protecting the trust fund rather than taking care of people who made this national sacrifice.
So this is great to hear because some vaccines have long-term effects that you don't start to feel till later on down the line. And the fact that you can't sue vaccine companies for injuries that originate from the vaccine, the product that is being pushed down our throats by Big Pharma, is frustrating. So to see RFK and his agency do right by the American people and provide compensation for the vaccine injured, it's really awesome to hear. And so now we have RFK dropping another bombshell regarding VAERS and its flawed capture system.
There were more injuries reported from VAERS by the COVID vaccine than all other vaccines put together for the past 36 years. There's a lot of people out there who say, this is part of the consensus. You'll see this on every mainstream, Anderson Cooper, Jake Tapper, all of these guys say again and again that the link between autism and vaccines has been debunked. But those studies that I was talking about earlier, the epidemiological studies, they only looked at one vaccine, the MMR, and one ingredient, thimerosal. None of the vaccines that are administered to children during the first 6 months of life have ever been studied for autism. In fact, the Institute of Medicine said that they looked at this issue, has it been debunked? And they said, no, these studies have never been done on the vaccines that are the most likely culprit, which is, DTaP, Hep B, the pneumococcal, the vaccines given in the first 6 months, none of them. They said the only one that has ever been studied is DTaP, which is diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. And they said that the one study that was done showed that, there was a link with autism, but we're not going to count that study because it was based on the VAERS system, which is CDC's only surveillance system. And they said that system is too unreliable. So what they were saying, the Institute of Medicine, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences, said that the only system that CDC has to study vaccine injury is so bad that any study done on it, we're not going to count. So in 2010, CDC designed a new system, and it was a machine counting system. The problem with VAERS, with the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, is that it's voluntary.
Yes.
And so the doctor has to, if he sees a vaccine injury, he's required to report it to VAERS. But there's no penalty if he doesn't. It takes him a half an hour to fill out the paperwork. So there's a big incentive for him not to do it. There's another incentive, though. He doesn't know if something's a vaccine injury. If you get a vaccine and then 4 years later, you come in with a food allergy, how do you know? Will any doctor in the world say that's a vaccine injury? Or seizure disorders? And the other thing is, so they don't know, what to look for. They've never been taught that at medical school. There's no course on vaccine injury in medical school, in any medical school in this country. And then the other thing is he has a big emotional incentive because he told that mom to give that child that vaccine.
Oh, yeah.
And if the child has a seizure 3 weeks later and she comes back and she says, I think it might be the vaccine, a lot of doctors will say, no, that's normal for that age. And they're not going to call it into VAERS. So CDC designed a machine counting system that would do essentially a cluster analysis. They would look at the vaccine and then they would look at clusters of injuries that were unique or anomalous to that vaccine. It was a very accurate system according to the group that designed it. It was a team led by a guy called Lazarus. And CDC paid for the whole thing, millions of dollars, and it was a long-term study. And they looked at one HMO, which was Harvard Pilgrim up in Massachusetts. They did this machine counting system for Harvard Pilgrim. And then they compared what the machine counting system had gotten, had yielded and collected in terms of vaccine injuries. And they compared that to what VAERS had collected during the same period at Harvard Pilgrim. And they said that VAERS was capturing fewer than 1% of vaccine injuries. And they had a system now that would capture over 95%. And they were very proud, and they brought it to CDC and said, our system works, here's the data. The data showed injuries in about 2.7% of vaccines.
Of all vaccines?
Yeah, all vaccines, about 2.7%.
Wow.
CDC saw that and said, we're not going to use the system. And they shelved it in 2010, and they've continued to use VAERS now for 22 years when they know that it doesn't work. When
Can you bring it back?
It was designed to fail.
Now, this is just wild. I mean, how do you have this new machine counting system that's capturing 95% of vaccine injuries compared to VAERS's less than 1% and still decide to use a flawed system? It's completely intentional. As RFK said, the CDC knows that VAERS doesn't work. So we need better data to know what's really happening, or else these doctors are going to be chasing these bonus structures, as mentioned before, knowing or not knowing that some of these vaccines have caused harm. Lastly, Tucker asked a question that's been on the minds of many in Congress. If you've seen or heard previous hearings with RFK on the panel, you have heard them ask this before, which is, why has RFK fired multiple credited scientists from the ACIP board? And here's his response to it.
What happened with the vaccine board? I keep reading you fired all these eminent scientists on the vaccine board.
Yeah, I fired all these what?
All these important, highly credentialed scientists.
Well, we fired that board because it was just an instrument. It was a sock puppet for the industry that it was supposed to regulate. So in 2002, the Government Oversight Committee in the United States Congress held hearings about that board, which is called ACIP, Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And they said that 97% of the people on that board had undisclosed conflicts. Congress said that, it gave an example. It said the rotavirus vaccine was approved by that board. And there were 5 members of that board at that time, and 4 of them had direct financial interests in the rotavirus vaccine. They were working for the companies that made the vaccine, or they were receiving grants to do clinical trials on that vaccine. They all had overwhelming financial interests. One of the people on that board was a guy called Paul Offit, who is one of the big voices for vaccines. CNN goes to him all the time when it wants to know about vaccines. He voted to add the rotavirus vaccine to the schedule when he had a rotavirus vaccine in development. Because it's now on the schedule, his developing vaccine is virtually guaranteed to get on the schedule. It's a competitive product, but once you say rotavirus vaccine has to be vaccinated for, his vaccine is now guaranteed to get on the schedule. The one they voted on, that he voted on, within a year it had to be withdrawn because it was causing this really disastrous disease in kids that is often lethal, called intussusception, that is agonizingly painful when your intestines kind of tie up against each other. And it kills children, on occasion. That vaccine was pulled the following year, and his vaccine then replaced it. He was still on the committee. He didn't vote on that, but he was still on the committee.
But he voted to make rotavirus vaccine mandatory for the schedule.
And he and his business partners, Stanley Plotkin and a couple of other people, sold that vaccine and to Merck for $186 million. He told Newsweek that he won the lottery. Oh, it's been said of him that he voted himself rich. So that kind of conflict was typical on that committee. But the most...
Did people know this was going on? That's such an obvious conflict.
The Office of Inspector General in this department investigated, and they said, this is a disaster, you got to change it. Congress investigated and said, you got to change it, and they did nothing. The most sort of glaring example of medical malpractice by this group is that they approved all these vaccines. We went from 11, remember, to 69 to 92. Not one of them had, except for COVID. COVID is the only one that had a pre-licensing safety trial that involved a placebo, a true placebo. And so all of those other vaccines were ushered in without safety studies. And that means nobody understands the risk profile of those products.
How can you do that?
It's because of agency capture. It's because the companies that were making these products said, if you can get your vaccine on the schedule, it's typically about $1 billion a year for your company, because you now have a trap market.
With no downside. You've got an immunity
downside.
shield.
First of all, the federal government oftentimes actually designs the vaccine. The NIH would design it. It would hand it over to the pharmaceutical company. The pharmaceutical company then runs it through ACIP. Runs it first through FDA, then through ACIP, and gets it recommended. If you can get that recommendation, you now got $1 billion in at least revenues by the end of the year. Every year, forever. So there was a gold rush to add new vaccines to the schedule, and ASIM never turned away a single vaccine. Everyone that came to them, they recommended.
97% of the panel had undisclosed conflicts of interest. Clearly financial. They get a cut for recommending vaccines made from their peers or even ones made themselves. It's malpractice. It's corruption, and it shows that Big Pharma is financially motivated and doesn't care about the risk factors. This is why we need someone to clean house. Now, I recommend watching the full interview, even previous interviews and congressional hearings that RFK has been in. RFK goes on to talk with Tucker about Anthony Fauci, touching on his hidden lab origins, about his immunity, his God complex, etc. Another thing I recommend is reading his book, The Real Anthony Fauci. I'm about 2/3 of the way done with this book, and so far it's been super eye-opening. He touches on Fauci's past, how he's squeezed his way through into being the director of NIH. He also exposes Big Pharma some more and their studies. He provides loads of sources as well so that you can actually verify them yourself. But yeah, as I said, we need someone to clean house, and I believe RFK is the one to do so. He's not perfect, but he's been a huge advocate for public health, and he's taken on Big Pharma before. He's been doing so in the courts for decades now. His track record shows he's not afraid of taking on these giants, and I hope he can be the one to bring everything to light and actually solve our national health crisis. As always, do your own research, check your sources, but really start to realize what's actually causing this health crisis we have here in America.